Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue in our in-depth study of the book of Revelation of the New Testament, and we are getting near the end. Last time we covered chapter 20, which dealt with the millennial kingdom, the binding of Satan, and the great white throne judgment. Today, we move to chapter 21, which deals mainly with John's vision of a new heaven, a new earth, and a new holy city or holy Jerusalem, depending on how it's worded, with the clear focus being on this new holy city. In his commentary on Revelation, Dr. Christopher Rowland of Queen's College, Oxford, England, teaches, "Here we come to the climactic end of John's repeated pattern of eschatological visions and judgments." Dr. Eugene Boring of Texas Christian University, in his commentary, writes that we now see the last depiction of the end revealed in this holy city concept. However, it is by far, and he says it's by far the longest detailed section in all of Revelation, and it comes at the end. Therefore, he says, it is the most important point John is trying to make in the book of Revelation. Because in that day and time, whether it be oral speech or whether it be the written text, the most critical point that was being made was always reserved for the end. And it usually involved a lot more detail when they got to the end. So this is really, chapter 21 is really the key chapter of the book of Revelation according to several scholars. Dr. Boring and other scholars teach that we should not assume this idea of a heavenly New Jerusalem, however, originated with John himself, or even with Christianity, because it clearly did not. It was already an established paradigm in apocalyptic tradition several hundred years before Christianity, and long preceded John even in Christianity, because we see similar things in Paul's writings. Some general references to it. It is in the Old Testament books of Isaiah, Psalms, and Ezekiel where the foundation seems to be laid. They don't deal a lot with it, but the foundation is there. The apocryphal books of Baruch, Tobit, and Enoch cover or expose it. The Dead Sea Scrolls writing describes their version of it. And historians outside the biblical area, Philo and Josephus, have it in their writings, the general concept. Dr. Bruce Messner at Princeton Theological taught that we should not assume, though, that all these sources envisioned it the same way, because they do not. He said the core concept is there in Isaiah 65, verses 17 through 22, as a promise that God will create an eternal new heaven and new earth. But whether John here sees this as what he's describing as a fulfillment vision, as the old heaven and old earth are being destroyed and a brand new one being created, is not clear from the Greek that John writes in. Translators tend to try to make it clearer, but they say they're not necessarily translating it using the best translation. Metzger says the Greek words used by John does not normally, in his time and age, mean necessarily totally brand new. The Greek that's there doesn't imply that. It's not the right Greek words in that time period. Those Greek words he used at the time of their use more often were used to convey the idea of a new kind or a new approach, not something physically brand new. Several scholars teach the Greek wording seems to convey the idea that there is some continuity between the old and the new. Yet, clearly, the idea seems to be there that this new is a radically different approach. And so as we go through this, we want to be picking up part of what that radical new is and what makes it radical. So Metzger suggests we should not fail to ask and then catch, as he uses it, what is new. He suggests that the key point is that God himself will have his home with the people. We must realize that Israelite Jewish paradigm was that contact with God was only at a distance and only occurred at the tabernacle or temple. We should recall from our study of Ezekiel that they believed God had abandoned them once the temple was destroyed, that is the first temple, and they were exiled to Babylon. That is why their temple, that they were present at the temple as commands on certain holy days, and it was their appearance there was there because that's where they were receiving messages from God, contact with God through appointed officials in their high priest and so forth. They return to that concept, even though Ezekiel presents towards the end a vision of something quite different. What happens when the Persian king allows them to return? They go right back to their old paradigm. And so the temple building concept, the second temple, is a concept under the old, not the new concept that Ezekiel tends to be envisioning. They return to this concept when allowed to go back there to Judea and not adopt this new envisioned system that Ezekiel tends to expose there in his book. Therefore, here John is implying at the end, God has established a new ordering of things, which he wraps up in his vision of this holy city God concept, holy city of God concept. Thus, in the end, God will dwell with his people, and God himself will be there with them to wipe away their tears, etc. And all that are there will be his peoples, plural. Throughout many places, the Greek is the oldest, most reliable manuscripts in Greek are plural. Most modern translations do not translate it as plural. Several scholars note that translational issues with this chapter are there in places. They're not long sections, it's just certain words. For example, one of them is that the modern versions tend to miss the critical nature of symbolism from this old tabernacle concept in the new city. In Revelation chapter 21, verse 3, John is quoting Ezekiel 37:27. Just about all scholars seem to note that, but with modification. They shall be my people, in Ezekiel is changed here to the plural in Revelation, to peoples, when using the most reliable, oldest versions of the Greek text here. The problem is not all versions of the oldest manuscripts are plural. The ones that are considered to be the most authentic are, but there are several other highly respected old manuscripts. So I believe the numbers I saw was of the 5 oldest, most reliable, 3 have it plural and 2 do not. So whatever shift tended to occur here in singular versus plural tended to begin to happen early. So you may find it in your Bible, depending on which Bible you're using, as singular or plural. Some say we should note here that the major Jewish transition contained here in John's vision, that there's major Jewish tradition here in this vision that he has, as well as there's also Hellenistic, that is Greek and Roman. For example, it meets the description of the ideal city laid out in Greek literature and in Roman literature of this time period. Thus, John seems to also be maybe making a point here also, some scholars note, that God's great city is well beyond man's idea of a city, and that's especially noted in this massive size of it. Even if it contains nearly all the same things that the Greeks and the Romans have said ought to be in a good city, then he just makes it bigger. Plus, this city of God, the holy city, will also have nothing in it that is idolatrous. There will be no idolatrous worship, but will instead reveal the one and only God of Judeo-Christianity. Dr. Eugene Boring and others devote some significant volume in their commentaries to discussing the theological meaning of what John envisions here. Boring's conclusion is that the key theological point, I should say, is that God meets God's people. Such is as much a statement about who God is, the doctrine of God, as there is, says Boring. It is also about what it will be like with God when Satan is no longer around to influence. We have to remember in the previous chapter, Satan was put away for a period, 1,000 years, then allowed to return for a little while, and then ultimately put away. So in chapter 21, he's ultimately put away. So once he's ultimately put away, this is sort of the idea of what is envisioned once Satan's influence is removed, Boring says. So Boring then cites Paul's concept, where Paul comments, God will be everything to everyone. And I'm sorry, I forgot what New Testament verse that is. Boring sees that as the reality, that's the reality of who God is, when there's not interference. Thus, he says that theology is buried in Revelation 21:3 and 4. And God will dwell there, and they will see his face, and his name will be on their forehead. God will be their God, and they will be God's people, meaning they will obey his will. That is followed for only the second time in Revelation, with God actually supposedly speaking. See, I am all things new, or making all new. Write this down, for these words are the truth. It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. The meaning being here, Boring says, that God does just His will is being done. It's being carried out. And justification occurs in the end. God is the end, just like He was the beginning. And the peoples are there with Him, and He with them. Notice there is not a separation. This key point now. There's not a separation in the heaven of a separate tabernacle or temple, if you want to go, in this new holy city. It's not there. It was there in Ezekiel's version. Why? Major point, there is no need for one. A temple or tabernacle is the only place where the people in the Old Testament could meet God or be close to God. So they went to that place. They had commanded assemblies at that place. Now God is actually, in John's vision, God is with the people where they live, and this word dwell. He lives, meaning He lives with them. So there's no need of the concept of a tabernacle, other than maybe the idea that the whole thing is a tabernacle. All 150 miles, 1,500 miles of it, if you will. So there's no specific Holy of Holies. That is no isolated place where you meet God. God's there all the time. As now the whole place is holy. All that's in there is holy. All nations, and not just Israelites, are there. This is a dramatic change in concept from the time of Ezekiel, the time of the Old Testament. The live Sunday morning class several years ago did an in-depth study of the book of Ezekiel. And part of the reason we decided to do it was the book of Ezekiel is an important book to understand in order to really understand a lot of the New Testament, or the differences between the New and Old Testament. So we recall that Ezekiel spent 4 chapters describing the temple sanctuary within his new system. And none of it's here. Yet John has no tabernacle or temple. And so we should ask the question and note the answer of why. Because there has been a very significant paradigm shift in theology from 500 BC, Judaism, Ezekiel's time period, to 90 AD, Judeo-Christian theology of John's time. Teaches Dr. Bruce Metzner at Princeton Theological. Through the resurrection concept, John does not need a renewed temple to be with God, unlike Ezekiel. God is accessible to all. The barriers have been removed. And the requirement to be there is that your name must be in the book of life, says Dr. Metzner. And God is not just available to a select society of people, i.e. Israelites, if you will, but to all nations is John's Christian concept. Dr. Christopher Rowland at Queens College teaches this paradigm shift is critical to get or to make sure we catch, because it is a key foundation to the revelation and vision in John, and it's different from Ezekiel, and it's different from Daniel. Such was not an option in Ezekiel's time. The concept wasn't there. They hadn't envisioned it that way, because They believed only that a select nation, Israel, were considered God's people. The best Greek here, Roland teaches, is plural and not singular. Thus, those redeemed here come from all tribes, all languages, and all nations, and not confined only to Israelites. Eugene Boring notes the massive size of the new city, 1,500 miles long cubic. Wow. Thus, there needs to be a lot of room once the devil is removed and all people are eligible for the reward. Thus, John seems to envision most people will obey God when Satan's influence is removed. After all, even in the Old Testament and throughout the Old Testament, Satan, or whatever they referred to him as, was viewed as what creates evil, and that evil is what separates us from God. Once the devil was gone, then humans and God are dwelling together. Boring teaches John's holy city is inclusive, is a significant, highly significant point in the theological shift from Ezekiel's vision to John's time, and that it's modified to be inclusive. But apparently it was fought even in early Christian translations, because we don't see the plural continue in some of the later Greek copies of it. Exactly why, we don't know. It is clear that John is quoting Ezekiel, and it is clear that Ezekiel's vision was only for Israelites as being holy. But John has moved the paradigm. Chapter 21, verse 24, the nations will walk, and that nations is plural, by the light of God, is the best translation there in the Greek, Boring says. And the kings of the earth, not kings, plural, will be there. The only requirement seems to be the limit to the name needs to be in the Lamb's Book of Life. It's interesting to perceive what things can be imagined once the influence of Satan is removed, is pointed out significantly by the scholars. The removal of Satan is a big part of what's highly significant in the theology of John here. And this opening up and inclusion theology that's here in this book of Revelation. Scholars say this is what's significant in chapter 21, and I hope it gives you some idea of at least how the majority of scholars, academic scholars especially, look at this chapter. Hopefully we'll be with you next week, and we should wrap up the book of Revelations within the next 2 weeks.